All right. It is the week of February 19th, 2024, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger, and today we've got a ton to get through. First up, we're going to talk about the UFC 300 main event. Is it the right business move? Lots to unpack there. I know fans and media have had differing reactions with Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill sitting atop the UFC 300 card. I'm going to examine it from a business perspective. Is this going to affect pay per view buys? Could it hypothetically affect ticket sales at this point? Lots to unpack and lots to look at because behind the scenes, it sounds like there was quite a bit of negotiating and pivoting going on by both the UFC and other fighters. So we're going to talk about that first. Then we're going to talk about the new streaming service that is being launched by Fox, Warner Brothers Discovery, and Disney. How will this affect UFC media rights negotiations? That's something I've been asked a lot. I've done some research on this, and the answer may very well surprise you. It's kind of a differing answer than I would have expected when I first heard the news. So we'll dive into that as well. Then we're going to do a quick hit section. We've got to talk about one championship and their deal with you next, Rizin and a bit of a scandal, as well as the UFC TKO really doing an Anaheim deal for several years. So we'll break all of that down. And then last but not least, we're going to circle things off with UFC Apex shows. Seeing more complaints than ever from fighters and media about Apex shows continuing to go on. I'm going to talk about the business of Apex shows and why they are here to stay indefinitely. I know we've talked about this a little bit before. Need to bring it up again because it seems like people aren't quite grasping the numbers as to why UFC is putting on these Apex shows. So, with that in mind, timestamps at the bottom as always. And all right, first up, we need to talk about the most recent, biggest news, one could argue, that the UFC 300 main event has been announced. Not in a grand commercial like 200 or during the broadcast, but immediately following the broadcast before the post fight press conference for UFC 298 that just happened this past weekend. Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill for the UFC Light Heavyweight Championship will sit atop 300 as the main event. It's an interesting choice for a lot of reasons, right? I know Ariel Helwani has talked on his show about different rumors. I had heard a couple of different rumors too that were more in line with Leon Edwards against someone or DDP defending against Izzy. I know that had been a bigger one. I had even heard Pereira versus Izzy, right, at light heavyweight, but that one, what I had heard on that one is again just in terms of Izzy bulking up might be a problem. Again, all conjecture. Nothing. Do not report that that's why that fight didn't happen. But with that in mind, you know, we have this as the official main event. Jamal Hill was interviewed about this and said, this came together a day ago. This was Saturday night, of course. And he said, yeah, yesterday is when it came together. Alex Pereira's team said 2 days before Saturday it came together. So this is not option A. It's 100% option D, E, F, whatever you want to call it. It's not top three, right? Um, as of this recording, Ariel Hawana's MMA Hour, uh, he stated that top choices were Leon versus Hamzat, Shavkat, or maybe Islam. Actually, is what he hinted at. I don't know about that in terms of I hadn't heard anything about Islam versus Leon, but it's quite possible, right? That's a super fight, and Dana talked about originally having a super fight headline 300, so that would work. But Dana did confirm in the UFC 298 post press conference that Leon Edwards got offered three different opponents and accepted all of them, and he gave him a kudos for that, which is a long way from when they removed Leon from the rankings for not fighting Hamzat on short notice, right? There's something of that nature. I forget the specifics around it. It seems like a lifetime ago, but essentially, Leon was inactive. Um, and air quotes for those of you listening via just audio. I mean, that was a whole ordeal, and he was not, not Dana and the company's favorite, but seems to be more of a company man now as champ, and said yes to three different opponent changes, which is indeed a big deal, um, given just, how hard that might have been depending when they were offered, um, how late in camp he was. So clearly that was the top pick for headlining this card, right? Was Leon versus someone. And that didn't come to fruition. Now Leon's not even on the card, which, sucks for him because he misses out on a bigger payday, hypothetically, which we'll get into in a minute. And one would assume, because Bilal Muhammad was not offered, I know there's a big controversy around that Leon's probably going to fight Bilal, unless they want to keep him on ice for whatever reason and have Leon versus somebody else headline a 303 or whatever. Um, but it's tipping your hand like that is not common of the UFC, right? Dana has said on multiple podcasts he's been working really hard to get a lot of different things done, a lot going on behind the scenes. To come out and say like, "Hey, this is the main event, and we also offered this dude three other fights," so he's essentially conceding that this was not option A. That's very rare of the UFC to do. Um, Extremely rare, in my opinion. They usually push, no matter what, push. This is the biggest, baddest fight we could do. That's why we're doing this, even if it's well, is it really? But and I know Arahawani also stated something along the lines that Pereira versus Hill was originally slated to headline 301 in Brazil, which would make a lot of sense, right? Um, Poton's homecoming, you'd have, kind of the hometown advantage would be a big deal. That fight, just on paper and in terms of if you're thinking about it from a fan perspective, makes way more sense on 301 than it does on 300, especially because Jamal Hill, it's been 8 months or something since his Achilles tendon ruptured or whatever. That's a quick recovery. So this is obviously not choice number one. And again, in business, sometimes this is the type of stuff you have to do. I think what a lot of people don't consider, right, is is particular juggling that must be done from the UFC's perspective in order to one offer fights that they are obligated to offer within a given year. I think it's 3 fights, right? They have to, or 2 or 3 fights they have to offer a fighter in a given year. And if those fighters say yes, it's like, well, even if they're hoping for the fighter to say no, there can be ramifications to that. And 2, another huge one is keeping events on average under 15-20% of revenue. Keeping that, fighter fighter pay costs at the 15 to 20% mark that they initially slated to investors and presented as this is, fighter revenue is and cost is going to be maxed out at 20% maximum. And it's been going, much lower than that. Part of the vertical integration through Dana White Contender Series, making that a feeder league, cutting, older veterans who aren't in the championship mix or aren't, putting on the big exciting fights where maybe they can make a name for themselves as a journeyman and not take too much extra money. We just saw payouts for UFC 298 because it was in California. And, those are big payouts for some, right? Whitaker, I think 300K and then 100K win bonus. Um, Volk getting 750K isn't terrible, right? A little shocking it's not at least a million, but is what it is. Um, but overall, this was one of the cards that had more veterans on it, and you see 70K win, 70K bonus, or 50K, 50K. One of the more expensive cards. Uh, Generally, what they'd love to do in the future is have a lot more, 25-25s or 50-50s max. And you do that by hiring more contender series folks on the bare minimums. And then once they re-up, if they're coming in at 10 and 10 in some of these, that's great. You re-up and you bump them up to 45, 45 or 30, 30. That's triple the money that they were fighting on originally. They're probably going to be okay with it. Right. And you saw in the early prelims, and you are seeing now more than ever on the early prelims, a lot of contender series versus contender series, or one fight in the UFC versus a contender series guy. And some of these fights now are, so I forget who brought it up. I think it was JHK, my boy. Um, said these couple of these guys aren't really UFC caliber, and someone replied, "Well, they are now." And that's kind of true. Like the overall caliber of athlete in the UFC, I still think as an organization, it's still better than any other organization. I think it's still miles ahead from the new PFL Bellator merger or one or all of that in terms of like, and I'm talking entire roster wise. We're not getting into a debate about top jams versus top jams, et cetera. Like if you're looking at the entire roster, right? Still think UFC is miles ahead there. But whereas they used to have, you know, these regional leagues like LFA and Titan FC and all this stuff producing very high quality guys and only the best of the best would get in. It's now opened up a little bit. I wouldn't say, and part of this is right with contender series and what they've tried to do now, it's not even necessarily they're not letting in like the worst people. It's that they're getting fighters much earlier in their career to come in. Right? You might have a 6-1 guy or a 5-1 guy, or maybe, depends on the weight class, really. I mean, if you look at heavyweights, man, they're heavyweights sometimes get a 4-0 or a 5-1 guy in there, and then, they end up not doing so well. But they're getting, more of those types of guys. Val Woodburn, 7-0 when he comes in. He fights Bo Nickel right off the bat. And then he almost KOs Ilbon Elliott, who Elliott was a pretty heavy favorite, right? And those upsets are happening more and more on the early prelims because again, you're talking about a guy with 8 fights total, which it used to be sure maybe 8 fights gets in, but only if they're really, like, dominating the competition or doing extremely well. Like, it's just a different type of entry point. And it's not that these people can't become amazing, right? We've seen, Charles Oliveira. We've seen so many guys who've had kind of setbacks, middle in careers, and then go on crazy runs. So it's not that they can't become amazing, it's just they're at a point in their career where that used to be like, "Hey, you're not quite UFC level yet," and now it's like, "Oh, no, come on in. As long as you're coming through the Contender Series, no problem." So this all circles back. I know it's a bit of a tangent there, but to look at, you know, balancing out fighter costs, 300 is definitely the exception to the rule in terms of, you know, high paying fighter cost fights. Like where you're probably going to end up having um a much higher fighter cost than normal, especially compared to 298. 299 is actually very stacked and maybe similar-ish, but I mean, y- I can't imagine 301, 302 is going to look anything like 300 in terms of cost. And that's how that's always been, right? 200 was the epitome of, man, this is going to cost a ton of money, especially when the original fight was McGregor versus Diaz 2. Are you kidding me? That was supposed to headline 200 with all the other fights. Yeah, I mean, if they had actually pulled that off, if McGregor hadn't had the media, obligation fight with Dana and all this other stuff, and instead it had been McGregor Diaz to atop that, and man, uh, yeah, fighter costs would have been through the roof, especially. Could you imagine if Jones DC, McGregor Diaz 2, and Brock were on that most expensive card in UFC history? I'm pretty sure. But so that's a huge part of the reason, right? So TKO comes over and they're number guys. They are number guys even more so than the UFC originally was in 20 before 2016. And the UFC was number guys, but they would keep legends on like Chuck Liddell and yeah, Matt Hughes, right? In Legends deals, just getting paid for life to basically do nothing. Forrest Griffin, who, as I talked about, I believe on the last episode, decided to stick around and actually, work for a bit. So they kept him. But, you know, they were far more laxed with money if you were a company man. They were still still very much working to reduce fighter costs, but you could be an exception to the rule. With TKO in charge under Ari Emanuel and now post this merger, that's not the case. And so everybody's like, why aren't you doing McGregor Chandler? Because you would definitely put that event as a higher cost than most events. And that's going to affect your earnings report because you're a public company. So when you go to report quarterly earnings and where you are, that's going to have a drain, right? And yes, maybe McGregor Chandler ends up doing, 1.4 million pay-per-views, sure. But if we go back to the fighter MRP topic that I've spoke on multiple times, in terms of what was found by Dr. Paul Gift is really it's the main and co-main that draw. And so let's say you, especially with that stacked to card at 300, let's say you get 1.6 million pay-per-view buys. Great. 1.6 million, that's huge. They tout it as a huge success. Great. It's gonna offset the cost for sure, make you a ton of money. Sure. Let's say instead of 300, they wait until 30, what is it, 303 for the International Fight Week or 302 for International Fight Week. Um, let's say they wait instead for that and they make 1.4 or 1.3 or whatever with just Connor Chandler being the main headliners. And then, yeah, you got a couple other fights here and there, but like that's pretty much the whole thing drawing everything. Well, it's better to space out that cost, right? And I also highly doubt you're going to get an extra 300K buys because of 300 or Connor and Chandler on headlining 300 versus 302, 303. I highly doubt it because as we've seen and through this research, like 78% of the time it's about the main event. The other 20% of the time, sometimes the co-main is why people buy. The other fights are pretty much not completely insignificant, but less than 95% of the reason why anybody would end up buying a UFC card. So, yeah, why waste Connor Chandler and up your overall event cost at 300? We're already going to be paying quite the cost between the championship fights already on the card. Again, throughout the card is still very, very good. People are acting like it's a terrible card. It's not. It's a very, very good card, but it's got a lot of notable names, former champs. It's going to cost more. Because as you can see from Whitaker's payout and other payouts, right? If you held the belt and then you go back down, I mean, you can still make a lot of money. It's still, as long as you're drawing enough and you're winning enough, right? Like if you're that perennial title fight former champ where you're right on the edge, you're basically the last gatekeeper for a new contender to go through, or you can earn your way back to a shot like Whitaker has or Holloway, or like I mean, you're gonna end up costing money, of course. So that's another big part of this. Um, I think that's a piece a lot of people are overlooking, right? Chandler and McGregor could easily, it sounds like they're both ready to go, could easily headline 300. And would that be the big fight to really, really make it feel like, oh, this is like a, once in a, not lifetime, obviously, but once in a, 7 year card or whatever it is? Sure. But number crunchers at TKO aren't going to do that because they've again run the numbers. They know it's not worth it. So then you have Pereira and Hill, and you have this after White has said he's working on a big super fight. That he's working really hard to make it. That every fight's going to blow people away. And so when that gets announced, there's obviously backlash from a fair amount of fans, from some media, people being like, "That's not." And yeah, I mean, if I'm looking at it from a fan perspective or even a business perspective, I don't think Pereira Hill is the biggest fight on that card easily. I think you could argue Holloway Gaethje for the BMF title, even though it's not a real belt, is a bigger fight. It has more, aura to it than Pereira defending the 205 belt against a contender that, never lost the belt, but neither of those guys are booming with popularity in a way that's like, whoa. I think Izzy versus Pereira is a better like media attention fight for sure. Right? You get the trilogy, you get it at 205 for a belt in MMA, that is, right? That I think that's a bigger fight in that regard. But again, didn't happen for whatever reason. So where you sit now is how's this going to affect business? Well, for tickets, they go on sale, I think, this week. So we'll see very quickly how it affects them in terms of, you know, is it going to really hurt ticket sales, whatever? I can't imagine it will because it's still an amazing card throughout, right? Like diehard UFC fans. If I'm a diehard UFC fan, I'm looking at this card and thinking, okay, like this is easily one of the best cards they've put on in forever, right? You look at the early prelims all the way through. I think the first fight is Garbrandt versus Figueiredo. It's a nice, intriguing matchup. Yeah, I mean, it's still an amazing card. It's not as good as 200 was on paper before all the pullouts, um, or even like 205. How good that ended up being, right? But I mean, it's a crazy, crazy good card. And so, given they've been able to nearly sell out or just crush live ticket events for cards like 297, which Dana White admits at 298 is not, the best card that they've done, and that he needs to go back to Toronto with a better card, with Strickland DDP being the headliner of that one. I, Ticket sales aren't going to really be affected by this. No, of course not. Ticket sales are going to be just fine. People are still going to be excited to go. It's still going to be a whole thing. Pay-per-view buys. Yes, this could obviously affect pay-per-view buys. If you have Leon versus Islam, for example, or Hamzat versus Leon, or Shafka, I mean, any of those three that were rumored, right? I think that draws far better than Pereira versus Hill. I don't know that Pereira is a a draw, right? Because he beat Izzy, but then he lost Izzy. Um, and yeah, he beat Jiri, I mean, which is awesome, but I don't know that he's going to pull massive numbers in that regard. We didn't hear big numbers touted um, post post that pay per view or anything. And with Leon, right? The big thing there is, remember Jorge versus Usman. Um, and again, their first fight wasn't the best fight. Obviously, it was pretty much Usman just wrestling all day long. But I mean, they broke over a million. And yes, there's pandemic involved, so yeah, of course. But I mean, the big takeaway from that is that there were more eyes there were more eyes on the welterweight division than normal, right? And yes, a lot of them don't come back, sure, but if you convert even just 10% of that million, that's another 100,000 buys that now would now want to watch Leon Edwards welterweight fight, and they don't really tune into other fights. Or sorry, Usman fight, and they don't really tune into other fights. And then you see Leon getting wrestled, and he gets that big knockout kick, and then he beats Usman pretty soundly. So one would assume, right, that based on conversion and those types of metrics, welterweight is probably going to be a higher draw division than some of these others, especially light heavyweight, right? Um, Again, if this is Izzy versus Pereira, that trilogy, I think that draws more. Connor versus Chandler, of course, does. But this, I with 78% or whatever it is of people buying for the main event and the main event alone, not really caring about the other fights. And again, we're talking about way past hardcores or semi-hardcore fans. We're talking segment, probably 5 or 4 and up from the UFC's 8 customer segment model. You see those 2, it's not exactly eye-catching to the point where it's like, "Oh, I wanna, definitely wanna buy that." I would have put Gaethje Holloway ahead. Gaethje is more well known for his, fight against Oliveira drawing so well. Yeah, um, so I do think it affects pay-per-view buys. Again, we probably won't know how much because it just is what it is. We don't have the insights that we used to since things went behind ESPN Plus. We've heard a couple of estimates from Sports Business Journal, or again, when Disney touts something, sure, but we don't have that info. Um, but I think it does significantly less than any Izzy fight and, a Leon versus Hamzat Shavkat or Islam. I just, especially Islam, yes, had some of his shine taken away with the first Volkanovski fight, but coming back and getting a knockout against Volkanovski, still being as popular as he was. If he goes up for that super fight, I think that draws pretty well. And I think that's probably the super fight they were talking about. Um, Dana mentioned at some point, right? I don't know. Part of me still believes Brock Lesnar was targeted for something, and that fell through because you know uh, lots of other stuff going on with Brock Lesnar. But we may never know there. And yeah, it's an interesting call, but it's probably the one they had to make because Leon Bilal certainly won't draw well, right? Given Bilal's style, they probably worry if there is still a higher non-hardcore audience watching welterweight, the last thing you want to do is have another wrestle fest. Even though Leon could easily knock him out, right? I mean, in their first fight, they got ended in no contest before the eye poke. Like, I mean, Leon hurt Bilal bad with a head kick. So maybe that happens and it's fine, but you don't want to risk that, right? You don't want to risk it being, 25 minutes of just wrestling. So yeah, I think this is a better move than that, but it's not as good as the other options, and it's a timing thing, right? You had to have somebody headline 298. I mean, obviously, the fact that this came together so late, and that Volkanovski talked about saving the UFC 300 card if it went well against Tapore, you wonder if they would have done something with him. I don't know who he would have fought there necessarily. I'm trying to think what would have made sense from that perspective, but maybe you have Volk headline. I don't know. Um, it's tough. It's a tough one. So yeah, we will see how this all goes, um, and we'll really see just um, how well they do from social media metrics and things of that nature. But yeah, I think that's the nature of the beast in this one, and I think that's why they selected this. Is Pereira versus Hill is the best option of the bad options. And tickets are going to be just fine. Hardcores are still going to watch. They'll complain, they'll watch, no problem. But pay per view sales, I think, will be lower than one would expect for such a massive card with so many other good fights down the card, right? If I remember correctly, 200 sold pretty well, but like Brock was supposedly the main attraction, um, even though he wasn't headlining. I think without kind of a superstar, defined superstar on that card, I think you're kind of stuck with we'll see what happens. Still should be an awesome night of fights. Still should do better than your average UFC pay per view in terms of buys. That would be my guess. But let me know your thoughts on the main event. If you think it was a good business call, if they should have done Leon Bilal, I want to hear that. Um, if you would prefer to buy that pay per view versus Hera versus Hill, especially. But yeah, I think this is just kind of the hand they were dealt, and they played it as best they could. All right. Next thing we have to talk about is the new streaming service that's going to be on the block, which is a joint venture between Fox, Warner Bros. Discovery, and Disney that is basically all about sports. Um, they don't have a name for this service yet. They're going to have, a one third, supposedly a one third ownership stake um, each in this new service, and it's going to really be all of your sports in one place, right? Warner Brothers obviously has a fair amount of baseball. Right now, they have basketball rights. I know that NBA rights media deal is being negotiated, but that would obviously be part of this. The UFC would be a part of this, according to the press release, as part of Disney and ESPN's offering. Um, Fox, right? You'd have football, you'd have golf. Like there's a lot of events here that make a lot of sense. CFP, college football playoff, and March Madness would be on this. Um, and it's rumored to be about a $40 per month or above price point, and it's targeting those people who are trying to get just all of your sports in one package, right? Instead of having Peacock and TNT and ESPN and Fox and basically cable. And there's been ever since this was announced, there's been a lot of, discussion around media rights deals, NBA being the biggest one since that's still up for renewal right now. And UFC, of course, too. But talk about, you've got three entities that were competing. Now they are all putting their content on a joint venture together, and they are essentially right. Uh, all hypothetically in bed together, right? What's preventing them from talking about, what they're offering? Each of them are offering for particular media rights deal and kind of colluding to get the best deal possible for media rights. I know that I think it's the DOJ, the antitrust division is looking into this, right? It's definitely several people are concerned. But at least in the MMA space, I've been asked this question a bit. How is this going to affect the UFC media right negotiations? So if you look at this announcement, you see the press release, go through the details, the initial thought that many will jump to is okay, well, this means that at least when it comes to Fox and ESPN and Warner Bros., they're all going to be bidding in the same area. And it's going to be, you know, less viable options out there because they're not going to be competing as much against each other because inevitably the content, if any one of three of them gets on it, the content will end up on this new platform. But that's not exactly how this is going to work. There is a great interview with John Skipper, who is Meadowlark CEO, Meadowlark Media CEO, I believe, with Pablo Torres and Dan, somebody else from the Dan Libetard channel on YouTube, where they really go into the details of this. They talk about, things like, first right of nations, which is a whole thing I'm not going to get into, but essentially says that, you know, um, based on the way that these media rights are negotiated, you can't, can't buy media rights and sell them to one person for this amount and then go sell them to another person for a higher amount type thing, right? It has to, like, you have to, if you're going to offer it to one uh, potential buyer, or potential service, you've got to offer that same amount across the board. So it's not, for example, ESPN couldn't buy the UFC media rights then for X amount of dollars and then offer, a couple of pay-per-views or something to Amazon at a crazy higher price, or events at a crazy higher price, while then they're offering it to their joint streaming service at a lower price. Um, I think I'm explaining that right, but go watch that interview for those types of details because those guys break it down in depth. But ultimately, what this is not a merger that threatens rights like people are talking about. This is more of a threat to YouTube TV, and is more similar to Hulu, right? Hulu, which a lot of people still don't know about, is and was the brainchild of, let's go up against Netflix, everyone. And it was Warner Brothers and Disney, and I think it was somebody else initially. It might have been Discovery initially before they merged, but it was a joint venture, same type of deal, right? Like right now, what Hulu is and what Disney is buying out is this was a joint venture of, or sorry, not Warner Brothers, Comcast and Disney. Comcast, NBC, and Disney together. And that's why you'll see, right? Like if you go to Hulu right now, you will see things like Parks and Recreation, I believe, or 30 Rock. And then that will also be available on Peacock, and it will also be available, but Peacock and Hulu. And then you'll see things like Echo, the new Marvel show, that'll be available on Hulu and Disney Plus. Like it is a joint venture, and Disney has agreed to buy Comcast out, so that will obviously change quite a bit of the offerings on Hulu. But that's what it was to compete with Netflix at the time, who basically was cornering the streaming market of, we're the big boss in streaming, we're what everybody knows. This was their way to compete before Disney Plus was stood up, before Peacock was really up and running. It was, hey, let's go in on Hulu to offer another service. And now Disney's going to own it outright. So you're going to have Hulu, Disney Plus, ESPN, all of that. And by the way, this doesn't even touch on the fact that around this same time that this merger was announced, ESPN announced they're going to do their direct offering, which means it's going to be, they've got ESPN Plus, sure, but they're basically going to take the ESPN channel right now that's on cable and just make that available just for streaming. I'm sure at a lower price than this bundle. And so when you think about that too, right? Why would, if this was a dastardly media companies coming together to steal all the sports rights, and these three are going to split all the profits and be a huge thing. If this truly was nefarious, why would ESPN announce their own direct to consumer piece, right? Especially when by the rules of first round nations and things like that, the majority of the profits for this, even though they're supposed to be split like a third evenly, I mean, this benefits Disney the most just because of where they stand in this position and where, the types of programs that they bring with March Madness and college football and all that stuff. So why would they also do ESPN Direct? And again, I think the main reason, as John Skipper points out, and I agree with him wholeheartedly, is that this is more of going after someone who is cutting cable and just wants sports, right? Because it's going to have other offerings too. Anything on TNT, right? Like Law and Order reruns or any of that stuff still will be available on this too. True TV, basically anything that Warner Bros. Offers. AEW wrestling is going to be is available on this. And the point of it is that if you have cable, right, for like 110 or 20 bucks or whatever it is, and you have traditional cable and you want to go to streaming, you're ready to make that leap. But really, the reason you have cable is so that you can keep all your sports. So you can watch ESPN, you can watch TNT, you can watch Fox when NFL is on and all that stuff. You get to keep it all. You get to get rid of all the fluff and the reality and all this extra stuff. And instead of paying 120 or whatever it is, you pay just 40 or 50, whatever it's going to be, less than YouTube TV, even at this point, and you get all your sports. And it's not a bad idea. It's a great idea. I mean, if anything, I know a lot of media rights companies are probably mad that this is happening because for the longest time they were told this can't happen. We can't allow this. And now, oh, guess what? These three are doing it, providing it past the necessary antitrust scrutiny and all of that. But it's far more a attack and disruption to cable and YouTube TV than it is to negotiating media rights at a lower deal. Because the risk reward, the cost benefit analysis on colluding, which would be illegal, right? If Fox and Warner Bros. And Disney all got together and said, wait, what are you offering the UFC for media rights? Or what are you offering the NBA for media rights? The risk to that happening, if that gets found out, is far more severe than the benefit of, oh, we got to like negotiate these rights down a little bit and do this. We're not talking the ability of these three to negotiate and suddenly they're able to get, a way better media rights deal for something like the UFC or NBA. right? There are clearly other big players. Netflix getting WWE Raw rights is big. Amazon is in Raw or is in media discussions and was in talks for uh, WWE um, and I mean UFC even right. I think Amazon is in talks for that. The fact they picked up one was I think they want to get into the MMA space. Apple TV is and Apple TV Plus, all that stuff. They're trying to get into that. Um, there are still plenty of other competitors out there that if you take these three off the board and merge them into one, it's not like you've taken the big three offers out there and now there will be nothing higher. It's not worth the risk to these companies. Why would they do that? It doesn't make sense. And then again, you talk about ESPN's direct to consumer. If I'm ESPN and I'm Disney, right? I'm probably aggressively going after UFC rights because there are going to be plenty of people, which I feel will be a lot of people that watch this podcast, who don't watch traditional sports or have never been into baseball, have never really been into hockey or basketball that much or the occasional NFL game, and they're just big MMA fans, and that's all they care about per week. Well, then they don't need to pay 40 to 50 bucks for this service. They can pay just for the ESPN Plus thing. And that's it. I mean, right now it's just ESPN Plus that's needed, and my guess is, well, no, that's not true. There are the occasional ESPN cards, right? So if you want everything, you pay for those two, and that's it. That's going to make way more sense from a Disney perspective because then they get all the revenue to that. All this is again is a joint venture that looks to go after and compete with YouTube TV. I feel like that's the main point of this, especially with YouTube TV getting Sunday Ticket right and really growing at the rate that they've had, where they seem to be the prominent. Okay, I'm leaving cable. I want something similar that's cheaper. YouTube TV is kind of it. This is a way for them to compete by you know really only offering sports because that's the thing. I think there's a solid shot that suddenly they're going to be like, yeah, we're not going to offer and give you the rights to Fox anymore, YouTube TV, or we're going to instead, you got to buy this app. Uh, or, hey, you're not going to be able to watch basketball on TNT on YouTube TV because you got to buy this app. I mean, and this is again, cable cutters, people that are wanting to cut cable that just want to watch sports. This is what it's about. I do not think it will affect media rights, UFC media rights at all. In negotiations. I really don't. There are too many other bigger players out there. Fox had UFC rights and obviously dropped them. I don't think they're looking to get back into it. Warner Brothers Discovery, sure. David Zaslav has talked about that. Um, and sure, they could make some offers, but they're also, their bread and butter is the TNT NBA rights, right? And hockey rights. And so they don't necessarily want to go down that road. If they lose the NBA rights, okay, they become more of a player. But I think if they get the NBA rights and pay a hefty sum, they're not looking to add on too much with UFC and looking in the ballpark UFC is. ESPN, this is their thing. This drove so much of their subscriptions, so many of their subscriptions to ESPN Plus. This is their main bread and butter right now on the app. Yes, they've added baseball games, they've added a couple football games, things of that nature. But I mean, I would be shocked if ESPN Plus doesn't if they didn't get the UFC rights for whatever reason, they don't lose just a massive amount of subscribers, like an insane amount. Um, I think it would be a big blow to Disney at this point. And I think Bob Iger and company have made it very clear that that's, something they're willing to go after aggressively. Now, again, let's say ESPN picks up NBA rights. Let's say they pick up some other rights that, changes that game. Well, okay, then it literally does change everything. But right now, with the media rights available, if ESPN didn't pick up the NBA, then UFC is their big breadwinning offering on ESPN Plus, and they kind of have to go after it. I think the UFC and TKO are hoping beyond hope that NBA goes back to Warner Brothers or Fox or somebody that probably isn't in as much of the running for UFC anyway, so that way it causes a higher bidding war between ESPN and someone like Amazon or whoever else wants to get in on it. That would be my guess. Um, and I mean, this could also be a partial hedge for ESPN, right? Like create this new app so that you're offering, all this stuff, and then if UFC rights do go away, they do go to an Amazon or an Apple or somebody, Netflix, something crazy like that, right? You are still getting money thanks to the other media rights under Fox and Warner Bros. It's a hedge in that regard. But they're still going to want to pick up those rights if they can. And they're still going to probably be aggressive because I think their ESPN direct consumer and their direct consumer a little bit less so because again you got March Madness and college football playoff, but which they just extended. But their ESPN Plus and it's still a big cornerstone of that offering. So I think if you're ESPN and you lose the UFC rights because you're colluding bidding, I think that's real bad for you as a company. I don't think Bob Iger's that dumb. I do not. I think this was a smart play by these three companies to entice those that are cutting cable to join with them for sports and to kind of push back against YouTube TV's dominance, which has been growing, especially with Sunday Ticket over the past couple years. So I think that's what this is. I cannot imagine that it's going to affect the rights negotiations. I think it's pretty much just a yep, we're going to get some revenue over here through this joint thing and kind of, make sure we're all staying afloat, but you still need to have the offerings. And only one company gets to pay for said offerings, right? I think it's a bigger deal if it's just like Warner Brothers and ESPN or just ESPN and Fox that go in on this deal. I think that changes quite a bit. But yeah, I mean, as it stands now, yeah. Or if you add Comcast to the mix, right? Add NBC and Peacock and all that to the mix. I think that then it becomes kind of a okay, you've taken a lot of pieces off the board. Yeah, that could lead to some more eyebrow raising. But the cost benefit analysis, the risk reward to colluding on these rights for what you would actually save versus just bidding on them normally is not worth the risk. Not even remotely worth the risk. Especially when you can do other things, right? Like as Skipper said, I forget what rights they were, maybe MLS or something, where he basically like called up a company and was like, "Hey, whatever they offered you, I'll pay $1 more than that." And it wasn't illegal. It was fine. It was just like, yeah, just add that and come back to me and tell me what it like that. Why would you not just do that? It's just yeah. Yeah. And you're gonna have a separate CEO. I mean, obviously they're gonna have to be safeguards in place. If all of a sudden you get, a bunch of crossover between people at ESPN and at this new company and all that, then sure. And there's always hubris. Again, we've seen hubris bring down quite a many company. Vince McMahon being probably the best example of that recently, where if he pays off that hush money, pays off the rest of that NDA, which is pennies to him. He's what, $2 million left on that NDA, and he decides not to pay it after selling his stock for like 600 million or whatever the hell it was. I mean, none of that firestorm hits the way it does, hypothetically. Depends. But I mean, hypothetically, that just goes away. It's wild. So hubris, I will never count that out. But I really don't think it's going to affect media rights negotiations for UFC. I think this is a completely separate deal. Let me know your thoughts. where you want the UFC rights to go. If you do think it could cause some collusion, let me know how you see that going down. I don't see it. I really don't think it's going to be that big a deal in terms of negotiations. It's just not. All right, next up is our quick hits section. Got three things to talk about. First off, One Championship has signed a exclusive deal with Next for broadcast and distribution in Japan. It's a bit of a shock as Abima, which was their old partner, Chatri had some close ties with Abima executives, and Takaru, who is one of their biggest kickboxing stars in one, right? He had the amazing fight with Super Lick, and the match of Takaru versus, oh man, the Rizin superstar. I'm Drake Riggs is gonna kill me for forgetting this name. Uh Tension. There we go. That drew crazy buys, right? Like 500K pay-per-view buys and was a massive event. So, you know, Takaru, big star in the kickboxing world, Japanese kickboxing world. He had a sponsorship deal with Abima where he was supposed to be exclusively fighting on Abima. And according to Chatri, legally and contractually, Takaru has to come along with one that contract supersedes the Abima deal, which might be kind of a scenario where Takaru was always allowed to fight on other places, but he just doesn't get paid for that. So Takaru was probably not happy, but it's a big shock in a lot of ways because again, you didn't expect one to make this type of deal with you next. You thought they would re-up with Abima, especially with Takaru there, and quotes from the press release here from Chatri Yudong. One is honored to kick off this partnership with you next, one of Japan's hottest platforms for live sports content. Bringing one back to Tokyo last month allowed us to once again feel the deep-rooted passion for martial arts in the region. Through this partnership with you next, we can't wait to continue delivering world-class martial arts action to all of our fans in Japan. And this is after he also said at the 165 post-fight press conference that, Japanese fighters come to want to get crushed. And a lot of people took that as an insult. A lot of others thought it was a way to kind of, get other Japanese stars to compete and move to the promotion to prove themselves. But yeah, so that's an interesting quote there. Uh, Tenshin Tsutsumi, I think is how you pronounce it. Again, I'm not the best at that. President and CEO of UNEX stated, "We are delighted to announce that the world's largest martial arts organization, One Championship with millions of passionate fans in over 190 countries worldwide, is now our exclusive partner in Japan. UNEXT strives to provide our beloved Japanese athletes a global platform to showcase their skills and share their incredible stories. One Championship is known for their thrilling live events, and the organization features a plethora of Japanese martial artists who compete on the world stage. We are committed to closely collaborating with One and bringing our heroes close to the fans. Please stay tuned for more exciting developments." This was also about a week ago, this press release, but it's a big deal for a lot of reasons. Again, Takaru probably not very happy. If I'm him, I'm pretty pissed because I had that sponsorship deal and now I almost certainly don't get paid. And it's one who again supposedly had a shorter runway. It's getting a new broadcast deal that you would assume was a solid offer to keep cash flow coming in. So it's big in that regard. And again, One is looking at expanding its growth. They did well on the 165 gate, so they're trying to keep that runway going and turn profitable. This is a step towards that. It's just kind of a shocking one. But so that's the first quick hit. Next, we will talk about the loaned $200 million yen to Rizin scandal. So this is reported from mbs-tv.co.jp, a news article talking about embezzlement in a case in which a former employee of General Construction Company and his eldest son were arrested on suspicion of embezzlement. This is all through Google Translate, by the way. So if I get this missed parts here or there, feel free to correct me if you can speak Japanese. But Hiroyuki Murata and his eldest son Toshiki, who are former Yamura employees, were arrested. Company executive in Nagano City were arrested on February 14th on suspicion of embezzlement. According to people involved in the investigation, Toshiki's company loaned 200 million yen. So they withdrew 360 million yen in deposits from a subsidiary of Yamarura, where Hiroyuki was in charge of accounting, then transferred that money to his son's account. And according to people involved in the investigation, Toshiki's company loaned 200 million yen to the company that runs the mixed martial arts event Rizin on the day the money was sent. That is not great, right? That's another scandal for Rizin, who has had, TV rights be scrutinized for their ties. Now you've got an embezzlement scandal, and 200 million yen is like 1.3 million or something around that range in US dollars. So it's a fair amount of money being funneled and loaned into Rizin. Um, we'll see what happens there, because obviously I would imagine the police are going to recover that money. It's going to be a thing. But yeah, not a not great press for Rizin, who is still trying to bounce back from some of their TV woes and some of the scandal woes that they've had and ties that Sakabura has supposedly allegedly had. Yeah, this isn't a great look for them all around. So that's something to keep an eye on. We'll see what happens if there are more developments in that case, or if it affects Rizin at all. But yeah, I mean, that's a fair amount of money. In fact, it was loaned to Rizin, and now they'll probably have to pay it back because it's part of a criminal investigation. Is not the best for a company that is not booming like the UFC. And speaking of the UFC and their parent company TKO, the last quick hit we have for you is the agreement that was signed with the Honda Center in Anaheim, where TKO has reached a 5-year deal to host MMA and wrestling events at Honda Center in Anaheim. Under the partnership, both UFC and WWE will hold at least 3 events at the arena across the next 5 years. Those events could coincide in the same week or be held entirely separately. This is from an article at Sportico. Under the partnership, both UFC and WWE, or I'm sorry, I just read that. It's unclear how UFC and WWE are being compensated as part of the deal. These partnerships sometimes involve cash payments, sometimes involve more favorable terms on the costs and revenue associated with the events themselves. So that's basically saying could be just a big, site rights fee, which we've heard the UFC negotiate about quite a bit, or it could be that they get a bigger cut of actual revenue of tickets and concessions and things like that. Either way, it's a big deal because I think this is the first of many collaborations, right? If you watched UFC 298, and my guess is this is happening before Monday Night Raw, which will occur live tonight um, at the Anaheim Center. I'm guessing you'll have a couple of UFC people there. UFC 298 had CM Punk there, had Bianca Belair and Montez Ford wrestlers there. Um, One of my favorite bits was that in the UFC 298, pre-activation centers where you can go meet and greet with fighters or whatever, they had the Monday Night Raw announce desk there. I don't think anybody was manning it like Michael Cole or anything, but you go see the announce desk. This type of collaboration, right, where they do these events back to back, is almost certainly how TKO is going to do things moving forward. Logistically, it makes tons of sense. If you can get the same employees to run the UFC event and then wait a couple days and run the Monday Night Raw event, you're going to end up like production employees, you're going to end up saving a ton in just logistical travel costs and all that fun stuff and per diems and all that whole shebang. You're also going to be able to negotiate deals like this where both uh, UFC and WWE are going to hold events together. That brings more revenue in, right? And there's some crossover there, but to a city, they don't care, right? Anaheim's getting a giant sold out UFC pay per view on Saturday, and then on Monday they're going to get a giant sold out. Which, looking at tickets, it is sold out right now. WWE Raw. That's big for them, right? And they probably pay a combined fee to get that. So in their eyes, again, it's worth it rather than paying separately for UFC and then WWE several days later. They just get to knock it all out at once. And that's important tax revenue and things for them. That's and important revenue for Anaheim, right? And they're trying to do this what's it called? Like Orb Live or something like that. OC Vibe, uh, which is an entertainment district being developed in downtown Anaheim around the arena. So this is similar to the LA Live in Los Angeles. But if if you go to, there's plenty of these places. If you go to, I think the St. Louis Cardinals baseball stadium in St. Louis, right? They have like a whole entertainment district that they're building around. They have a lot of shops and things. It's South Park Soto Sopa type stuff. If you know what that is, this is just again more pumping in more revenue for these projects. It's a good deal all around. You're gonna see way more of this, way more cross promotion too. There's only a 5-ish% crossover between UFC and WWE fans right now. One of the biggest goals of TKO, as Dana White alluded to, and as Paul Levesque has alluded to, is to increase that crossover fandom, right? In an ideal world, they want every WWE fan to be a UFC fan and vice versa, because that strengthens their brand like no other. And with both brands being as strong as they are right now, this is a good time for them to push it. So imagine I'm going to Anaheim to go do UFC 298, and then I decide, you know what, I'm going to be around for a couple days. Maybe I will go to Monday Night Raw. Why not? Because I hear, I don't know, somebody's going to be there. Sure, that's small step one, right? Um, I think you're going to end up seeing far more, Conor McGregor punching out Big Show, like Floyd Mayweather punched out Big Show. I mean, not Big Show because it's not with the company anymore, but you know what I'm saying, right? You're far more crossover from UFC fighters into WWE scripted segments. Um, you're going to see way more attendance of WWE superstars at UFC events just for cross promotionals. It's gonna be this is just the beginning, I guess is my point. So expect a lot more of that. Yeah, this is step one of a much larger plan. So with that in mind, those are my quick hits. Let me know if I missed anything, but that's what I got for you this week. All right. Last thing to cover, and just briefly cover, might actually be shorter than quick hits, is the Apex shows. Got to go over this again, just to break down the numbers a little bit more, right? But saw a lot of people talk about and complain about UFC Apex shows, particularly the last one we had before UFC 298 with Hermanson um, versus Joe Pfeiffer, and you had Hermanson also complain about it, right? And just state, get me out of the Apex. It's not great. It's not a great environment for fights. No, and it's at least in terms of a live audience and hearing a crowd roar, that's not the place for it. Of course not. But this was always in the UFC's roadmap. Dana White talked about it before the pandemic. They were able to utilize it during the pandemic in big ways, and then just stuck it around. This was inevitable. This saves them so much money. And if you look at the cards that they put on at the Apex, right? These are not cards that are these are a ton of contender series guys and then like one or two ranked names. What's the next one? Isn't it like Rosenstruck versus Shamil? Like, I mean, these are not big name cards at all. These are lower cost cards on that end, probably to be offset by the lack of ticket revenue in some ways. But they fulfill the offerings that they have to give to fighters because you have to offer so many fights a year. You're able to just stack them with 10K, 10K guys. Even the main event, I doubt they're getting more than 150 to show and win. So it keeps them low cost. And it's, you know, it is a scenario where if you look at the seats, because this is another thing that was brought up. At one point, they talked about adding about 1,000 seats in the UFC Apex so you could have like bigger shows. But right now, it's all of the VIP experiences. That's the only way you can get in there. And those VIP experiences, I think, are like 1,000 minimum or something, and they're almost always sold out. So you've got sold out VIP experiences or near sellout VIP experiences almost every time, sometimes with celebrities there. Your fighter cost is super low. You're fulfilling one of the many uh, shows that you have to under your ESPN agreement, right? You have to have so many shows per year. Otherwise, you're in breach of contract. You lose money. It's a whole thing. Why would they change this? Oh, viewership will go down. It will it? I have yet to see anyone not watch these cards. The only way, said this on Twitter and I'll say it again, the only way to meaningfully affect change here is if enough people stopped watching these cards regularly over a long enough period of time that they would have to do something, whether it's beef up the cards more in terms of fighters, which is probably what they would most likely do, rather than go back on the road. Like, right, their first lever is not, oh, we got to go back traveling again. It's definitely, oh, let's put some higher ranked fighters on here that hardcore fans really won't want to miss. You'd have to, it would be have to be over multiple events, so many events, like probably like a 6 month to a year period, to be honest. Um, and it'd have to be done in such a way that the trend was so bad that ESPN would have to say, like, hey, this isn't, looking great for our renewal. We got it, I don't love these Apex cards. Anything you can do about it. And for that to be a big enough deal that they're gonna reach out to the UFC for that, like, it's never gonna happen. Hardcore fans are gonna tune in and watch UFC every weekend. Enough of them are gonna tune in and watch those Apex cards every weekend. It's here to stay. It's only gonna get worse. We are not at peak Apex. Get it? We're not there. We are not even close to being there. So yes, you can complain. Yes, I understand your complaints. Don't get me wrong. I don't love it either. But from a UFC perspective, you're saving so much money. You're fulfilling your media rights obligation. And mind you, once they renegotiate this next term, then they have literally zero incentive to change it. Zero. I mean, right now they're in a negotiation window, so like this would be the time. You'd have to have a huge push of people just never watching Apex cards, no matter who's on the Apex card. And then they might say, like, all right, we're gonna start going out on tour more, going back to these cities. Like, I think it was Wichita, Kansas was one of the last it was either 2019 or 2018, where they went to Wichita, Kansas, and they only made like 440,000 gate or something. It was like JDS versus Ivanov Blagoy as the main event. Wasn't the best card, obviously. But they went to Wichita, Kansas. It was one of their lowest rated cards. They might have been one of the cards they didn't actually make a profit on tickets, or they just made a profit. I don't think they actually did. I think they lost a little bit of money. And that right there is just a prime example of if they had to go on the road regularly, it reduces the scarcity, which is a big deal right now. That's a huge reason why all of these UFC events sell out so much, is because there's scarcity around going to them. Uh, and it takes away your profit margins by just all the logistics of going to a place, setting up, doing all that stuff, right? And it's all about growing your profit margins. That's their whole point. It's TKO. We just talked about it. It's never going away, guys. It never will. So I hear you. I really do. Uh, I see you, Kaposa. You're right. You're not wrong in terms of just how much it sucks to have some of these performances, not have a live crowd, not have that atmosphere for it. But it's not going away. It's especially when, to make the math worth it, it would require a big effort from hardcore fans, like really a straight up protest for a long, long time. Now, if it really starts turning off fans and there's to a point where they stop watching and it's a whole ordeal in that sense over a period of time, sure. But this is the window it would have to happen, because let's say they sign with ESPN. I think this is their negotiation window, but 2025 rights are up. So let's say they sign ESPN January 2025, another 7 years or something crazy. I mean, it's just Sorry, we glitched out there. I don't know exactly where we glitched out, but let's say again that they sign their rights away for next 10 years. Then they can people can stop watching Apex shows all they want. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter at all. Not even in the slightest. So I they're here to stay. You got to deal with it. It is what it is. Sorry to you all, but they're not going anywhere. They are the future of most regular events. I think this is the model moving forward. I imagine you will see a slight reduction in non UFC pay per view events traveling moving forward, and then we'll hit a saturation point, and that'll be that. Until they can find a way to make more money that way, it's not going to happen. Sorry, y'all. I really am. I'm sorry. All right, guys, that wraps up another episode of the Fight Business Podcast. Appreciate and love y'all for listening. Sorry about last week, just lots of stuff going on. But again, doing all right health wise, so going to keep this regularly rolling. Hit a like, subscribe, bell notification, follow, all that stuff if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher's dead, RIP Stitcher, any of the other audio versions. Appreciate y'all as always. And until next time, get money.